The voicemail lasted 47 seconds. Cal Merritt had listened to it 3 times sitting in the parking garage of the Harmon Building engine off the late Tuesday afternoon light, turning everything the color of old brass through the concrete slab.
Why did you do it?
Marcus
I didn't have
Hadley's
a
voice
choice.
came through the
There's
car
always a
speakers, clipped and
choice.
efficient.
Not this time.
The voice of a man who scheduled even his discomfort into 15-minute blocks. Hey, it's Marcus. Look, I know it's been a while. She mentions you sometimes. She won't say it directly, but I think I don't know. Then 4 seconds of nothing. Not dead air. Something with weight in it. Something that breathed. Then the line went dead. Cal sat with those 4 seconds longer than he sat with the rest of it. A man who had more to say and chose the parking garage of a different building, a different city, to not say it. He'd known the Hadleys since his sophomore year at State when Marcus had been assigned as his roommate, and their friendship had calcified fast the way college friendships did, forged in 2 a.m. pizza runs and bad decisions and the particular intimacy of sharing 60 square feet with someone for 9 months. Ruth Hadley had entered his life through that friendship, like weather enters a house gradually and then completely. She'd driven 4 hours to his graduation when his own mother had called 2 days before with a flight cancellation and an apology that arrived smoothly practiced. Ruth had stood in the sun with a handmade sign she'd clearly lettered herself, the kind of sign that embarrassed him at 22 and made him ache a little now at 38. Gary Hadley, Marcus's father, had gripped his hand at the reception afterward and said, "You're one of ours now, son," with the easy certainty of a man who meant it completely and expected nothing in return. Gary had died of a heart attack 4 years ago, April, on a Tuesday. Cal had driven to Maple Drive 2 days after the funeral because he'd missed the service itself, a work crisis he'd told himself was unavoidable and which he now remembered only as the shape of the excuse, not the substance. He'd held Ruth in the front hallway while she wept, her slight frame smaller than he'd expected against his shoulder, and he'd said, "I'll come back. I'll keep coming." Ruth had pulled back and looked at him with wet eyes and said, "I know you will, sweetheart," in the tone of someone who had already decided to believe it because the alternative was too bleak to consider. He had not gone back. Not once. Not in 4 years. The Henderson proposal was open on his laptop when he got back to the office, 14 pages of network security architecture for a regional healthcare provider that represented 8% of Merit Security Solutions' annual revenue. Cal had built the company from a spare bedroom and 2 clients a decade ago. It now ran 40 people and occupied a floor and a half of the Harmon Building, and Brian Taft, his business partner and the operational engine that kept the whole thing from flying apart, had the Henderson account flagged in red at the top of their shared project board because the client had called twice in the last week asking about response timelines. Cal opened the proposal, read the same paragraph 3 times, closed the laptop. He played the voicemail a 4th time. That evening he picked up Lily from Dana's, which was the arrangement on Tuesday and Thursday, and every other weekend a custody schedule so thoroughly negotiated and calendar blocked that it had its own color in his scheduling app. Lily was 5 3/4, and she treated the fraction as load-bearing, correcting anyone who rounded down with the patient firmness of a tax attorney. She came through Dana's front door wearing her dinosaur backpack and carrying a drawing she'd made at after school. Care, a purple and green creation that she explained during the first 4 minutes of the drive home, was a brachiosaurus eating a cloud, but the cloud is actually a bush. But I made it look like a cloud because it's more interesting. Cal asked 3 questions about the brachiosaurus's motivations, and Lily answered all 3 with the seriousness of a peer-reviewed paper, and for most of the drive he was genuinely, completely present, which was the best he could say about most things lately. It was later at the kitchen table, with Lily's puzzle spread between them, the 80-piece dinosaur habitat puzzle she'd already completed 14 times but insisted on doing again because practice makes permanent, daddy not perfect, that Cal mentioned he might visit someone this weekend. An old friend. Lily's hands stilled on a puzzle piece. New friend or old friend? Old. From college. Her name is Ruth. Her son was my roommate. Lily fitted 2 pieces together without looking up. She had her mother's hands slender and precise, and Cal's habit of thinking before speaking, which Dana had once described as his most useful and most aggravating quality in the same breath. "Old friends need more visits than new friends," Lily said in the tone she used for obvious truths, "because they already know you left." Cal looked at his daughter over the half-assembled Jurassic landscape. She was examining a puzzle piece with the forensic attention she gave to everything, turning it in her fingers, looking for its place. She had not looked up. She was not making a point. She was just saying a true thing the way 5-year-olds said true things without the padding adults used to make truth bearable. He sat very still for a moment. Then, "You're right." "I know," Lily said. "This piece goes here." She pressed it into place. He drove to Maple Drive that Sunday. The house was the same shade of blue it had always been, but something about it had changed in a way Cal took several minutes to identify sitting in the car before he got out. The color itself was intact, but had faded slightly at the southern-facing eaves where the sun hit hardest. The garden that ran along the front walk had been one of Ruth's genuine devotions. She'd maintained it with the precision of someone who understood that a garden was a living argument against entropy, and now it had gone quiet. Not dead. Everything was technically alive. But it had the look of something that had stopped being tended and was now simply persisting on inertia, hanging on out of habit rather than care. The mailbox at the end of the walk held a wedge of envelopes too thick for what the slot could comfortably manage. Someone had tried to push the overflow down and failed. Cal counted at least a week's worth, possibly more, before he'd even reached the front porch. He'd rehearsed an opening line during the drive. He became aware of this fact standing at the door, the specific embarrassment of a grown man who had prepared remarks for a friend's front porch and pressed the bell before he could revise the line a 5th time. The footsteps inside were slower than he remembered. A different pace entirely from the Ruth Hadley who had moved through her kitchen like someone who owned the physics of the space. The door opened. She looked at him for a full second before anything else happened. Not surprise exactly, something more complicated, more guarded. Her hair had completed the transition from the carefully maintained auburn he remembered to a full gray, pulled into a simple ponytail, and she was wearing a cream cardigan over dark slacks, and she was thinner than 4 years ago, not alarmingly, but noticeably the cardigan sitting differently on her shoulders than clothes sat on a person who was eating well. What he noticed most was the single second of brightness in her eyes when she registered who was standing there. Real brightness, the unmistakable kind, followed immediately by a conscious, visible dimming, like someone who had learned to turn down the volume on their own hope before it could cost them anything. Cal. Just his name. Not a question and not a greeting exactly. More like a confirmation that he existed and was standing on her porch, which she had apparently decided to verify before committing to anything further. The interior of the house hit him with something that was partly memory and partly grief. The hardwood floors with the familiar creak at the third board from the kitchen doorway, the family photographs lining the hallway, which stopped at a certain point, a hard stop. No new additions, the chronology of the family ending at a specific year and staying there. The kitchen visible at the end of the hall with its window over the sink and the window letting in good afternoon light that fell across a counter that was too clean. The cleanliness of a space used very little. One mug on the kitchen table, and even from the hallway, Cal could see that the coffee in it had long since gone cold. The wall calendar in the kitchen said November of the previous year. Ruth moved to put the kettle on, and Cal sat at the kitchen table, and they fell into the practiced rhythm of people catching up. After too long, the conversational structure that both parties know is preamble, the polite warming up that precedes whatever the visit is actually about. She asked about his work. He described the company in general terms. She asked how Lily was. She knew about Lily from Marcus, she said, though she'd never met her, and Cal took out his phone and showed her photographs, and Ruth held the phone in both hands and looked at each image carefully, not scrolling quickly, actually looking. "She has your eyes," Ruth said. "That same considering look, like she's already decided something but she's giving you time to catch up." She handed the phone back. "How old?" 5 3/4. The fraction is non-negotiable, she'll correct you." Ruth almost smiled. Not quite, but the shape of it was there. Cal asked how she was. She said fine, she was keeping busy. The library had a new reading program she'd been helping with, and she'd been meaning to get back to her book club. Every sentence arrived at the correct cadence, warm and well-paced, and every sentence contained approximately nothing. It was the verbal equivalent of the garden out front, structurally intact, technically alive, but not actually being tended. Ruth. He waited until she looked at him. How are you really? Not a question. Not quite. She understood the difference. She looked at her hands for a moment. Outside, through the window over the sink, a bird crossed the yard in a low arc and was gone. When she spoke, she wasn't looking at him. Do you hear that? Cal listened. The refrigerator ran. The clock above the stove marked time. Nothing else. It's been like that since December, Ruth said. Same year Gary died. By December it was like this. A pause. You get used to it. That's what I didn't expect. Not that it would be hard, I knew it would be hard. I didn't expect to get used to it, because once you're used to it, you stop fighting it, and one day you can't remember what you were fighting for. Cal kept his eyes on her face and let the sentence settle. He didn't fill the space after it with reassurance. He'd learned in 5 years of being the only adult in his apartment on the nights Lily wasn't there, that reassurance offered too quickly was just noise. It told the person speaking that you'd heard enough to respond, not enough to understand. After a moment, he asked about Marcus. He watched her face do the thing it had done when she opened the door. The careful adjusting of expectations, the bracing. She began the familiar inventory. Marcus was doing very well, had been promoted again, was running nearly his entire department. They were so proud. The sentences came out polished and rehearsed, worn smooth by repetition. She stopped herself in the middle of one. Just stopped mid-clause and looked at Cal with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of exhausted transparency, the look of someone who has run out of energy for the performance. He sent you, she said. Cal didn't insult her by denying it. She nodded slowly, the nod of someone confirming a thing they'd already known. He called me last month. We talked for a few minutes. He said he'd call back. She moved her hands on the table surface, a small, purposeless motion. That was 5 weeks ago. Something shifted in Cal's understanding of the visit. He'd come because of guilt. Yes, 4 years of accumulated absence. A 4-second pause on a voicemail. Lily's voice at the puzzle table. But he'd also come, he now understood, because Marcus had found a way to address his guilt without spending any of himself. Send Cal. Cal will go. Problem managed. Cal felt a flash of something sharp about that and then felt it redirect because in 4 years he had not called, had not visited, had not sent so much as a card at Christmas, and he had no Marcus to outsource the responsibility to. He had simply chosen repeatedly not to come. I should have come back sooner, Cal said. I told you I would and I didn't. I don't have a reason that holds up. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. You're here now, she said finally. Not absolution, just fact. He stayed for 2 hours. The conversation moved the way real conversations moved when the preliminary material had been cleared away unevenly, doubling back, finding depths in unexpected places. Ruth talked about the library program with genuine warmth that made her sound briefly like herself, animated in a way that the earlier part of the visit hadn't been. Then she mentioned the book club, and the light shifted. She'd missed the last 6 weeks, she said, and when Cal asked why, she said she hadn't been feeling well, and something in the way she said it, a slight flattening of tone, a too quick pivot, told him it wasn't illness. She told him about the garden, how she'd let it go this spring, how Gary had always helped in April, the heavy work turning the beds, and she'd kept meaning to get to it and then kept not getting to it, and now it was June and the window had passed for most of what she'd meant to plant. Cal looked at the calendar on the wall. November. He thought about the stack of mail at the end of the walk. When's the last time someone was here? He asked. In the house. For a meal. Ruth thought about it with the visible effort of someone reaching for a date that had gone soft at the edges. Marcus came at Christmas. Christmas Eve he had to leave the next morning. There was something with work. She paused. Before that, Patrice was here in the fall. Late September, maybe October. Another pause. Eleanor from next door brings things over occasionally. Casseroles. She's kind. 8 months at minimum. Possibly longer, depending on how loosely you defined a visit where someone stayed long enough to eat. "I want to ask you something," Cal said. He waited until she looked at him. "Lily has her first piano recital next Saturday, 2 o'clock Community Center on Elm. She's been practicing every night and she's terrified, although she would never use that word. She'd say she's preparing extensively." Ruth made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I'd like you to come. I'd like her to meet you." Ruth looked down at her hands. He could see her working something out, some internal accounting he wasn't privy to. "I don't want to impose on—" "You came to my graduation," Cal said, "when my mother couldn't make it. You drove 4 hours and you stood in the sun with a sign you'd made yourself, and I was 22 and I didn't say it properly, but I never forgot it. Not once in 16 years. He paused. "Let me return something." She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he didn't feel it. Long enough that it became its own kind of answer. "I'll need to know what to wear," she said finally. "I don't want to be overdressed." "Lily will be in purple," Cal said. "She describes it as the color of royal dinosaurs. Aim somewhere in that neighborhood." This time Ruth actually laughed, brief and genuine, and for a moment Cal saw the woman he'd known at 30, the one who could dismantle a room's awkwardness with a single well-placed sentence, who had made his college years feel anchored when nothing else did. The laugh faded but left something behind in her expression, some warmth that hadn't been there when he arrived. He stood to leave. Ruth walked him to the door. On the front porch, with the afternoon moving toward evening and the quiet street doing its quiet thing, he turned back. She was standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other hanging at her side. "I'll text you the address," Cal said. "I'll be there," Ruth said, and in her voice was the careful hope of someone who had made that particular decision, the decision to believe a thing before the evidence was in, and was holding it at arm's length, ready to be wrong, allowing herself to be right. He was halfway down the front walk when she said quiet enough that he almost didn't catch it. "You know what the hardest part isn't? It isn't the quiet. It's that you start to think the quiet is what you deserve." Cal stopped walking. He stood with his back to her for a moment on the cracked front walk of the blue house on Maple Drive with the overgrown garden on either side of him. Then he turned around. "It's not," he said. Ruth looked at him, said nothing. But she held his gaze, and that was its own kind of answer. He drove home through the early evening, through the particular amber light that June afternoons produced in this part of the country, through streets he'd driven 10,000 times. His phone buzzed twice on the passenger seat, Brian almost certainly about the Henderson proposal, and he let it ring. At his apartment he made dinner pasta with the jarred sauce that Lily had pre-approved as acceptable on non-Lily nights, and ate standing at the counter going through his email. He answered 3 work messages. He did not open the Henderson proposal. He opened his calendar instead and blocked out the following Saturday from 1 o'clock onward and labeled it Recital/Lily, and then added below it in the same block, Ruth. He was brushing his teeth when he remembered the mail stacked in Ruth's box, and the calendar stopped in November, and the kitchen too clean for a woman who used to cook the way other people breathed, and he thought the dinners are a start, but they are not a system. 1 visit a week, 2 visits a week, these were gestures. He was not sure yet what the right architecture looked like, but he knew it was more than he'd put in place so far. He turned off the bathroom light. His phone on the nightstand showed 1 unread email from an address he didn't recognize. The name in the sender field was Eleanor Webb. The subject line was blank. He almost put the phone down. Something made him open it. The email was 4 sentences written in the careful grammar of someone who had composed and recomposed before sending. She introduced herself as Ruth Hadley's neighbor on Maple Drive 6 years running. She said she was not an alarmist by nature and had spent several weeks debating whether to contact anyone at all. She said that approximately 6 weeks ago she had woken at 2 in the morning and looked out her bedroom window, which faced the Hadley backyard, and seen Ruth standing alone in the yard in the dark. Standing still, not moving, not doing anything, just standing in the dark yard in the middle of the night. Ruth had not known she was being watched. Eleanor had watched until Ruth eventually went back inside, which had taken a long time. She had found Cal's contact information through the Hadley family's address book, which Ruth kept by the telephone in the kitchen and which Eleanor had been given access to once in an emergency 2 years prior. She had decided to use it now. The last sentence read, "I didn't know who else to contact." Cal read the email twice. He set the phone down. He picked it up and read it a third time very carefully, the way he read security contracts, looking for the specific weight of each word, looking for what was being said underneath what was being said. He turned off the light. He lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the apartment settle, thinking about a woman standing alone in a dark yard in the middle of the night, not moving, just standing there with no reason to perform wellness because no one was watching, and about the fact that someone had been watching and had spent 6 weeks deciding whether to tell anyone, and had finally decided to tell him not Marcus, not Patrice, not a doctor or a neighbor closer in age. Him, the man who hadn't visited in 4 years. He thought about what that said about the state of Ruth Hadley's support system, and the thought sat on his chest with considerable weight. In the morning he dropped Lily at kindergarten. She was carrying her backpack and a drawing she'd made at the kitchen table before breakfast, a crayon rendering of "A Lady I Haven't Met Yet" that featured purple and green and what Lily described as the expression of someone who used to smile more. Cal had looked at the drawing for a moment before putting it carefully in his bag. He didn't ask how she'd decided on that expression. He'd stopped being surprised by what Lily absorbed from conversations she wasn't officially part of. At the school gate, Lily turned back one last time the way she always did, some ritual of partial return before the full departure. "Is she lonely, Daddy?" "The lady?" "Yeah," Cal said. "I think she is." Lily's face did the thing it did when she processed something that troubled her, a slight tightening around the eyes, a compression of the mouth, the visible effort of a person taking a difficult thing seriously. Then we have to go. Not we should not. We could. We have to. The syntax of obligation applied with the precision of someone who understood that some things were not optional. She ran through the gate. Cal watched her go, the purple backpack bouncing, already turning toward a cluster of friends 20 yards away. He stood at the gate for a moment after she disappeared into the building. He called Eleanor Webb from the parking lot. She answered on the first ring with the alertness of someone who had been waiting. She was not a dramatic woman. She told him what she had observed over 2 years. Not everything she said, just the things that accumulated in a way she couldn't explain away individually, but couldn't ignore collectively. The mail. The lights left on all night, every window lit at 3 and 4 in the morning, then dark by the time the neighborhood started waking up. The garden going from the thing of precise beauty it had been when Eleanor moved onto the street to the current state of careful neglect. She'd brought over a casserole 6 weeks ago just to have a reason to knock, she said, because sometimes a casserole was a question disguised as a casserole and the fridge had been nearly empty. Not recently, shopped and almost depleted, empty. The empty of a fridge that had been that way for a while. "She told me she'd been meaning to get to the store," Eleanor said. "She said it very normally. I don't think she noticed how I was looking at the fridge." Cal asked Eleanor what she thought Ruth needed. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I think she needs to matter to someone," Eleanor said. "Not to be taken care of. She'd hate that. She needs to matter. There's a difference." Cal thanked her and sat in his car in the school parking lot for several minutes after hanging up, watching the other parents pull out one by one until the lot was nearly empty. He thought about the word Eleanor had used. Matter. He thought about the November calendar and the cold coffee and the too clean kitchen and a woman standing alone in a dark yard at 2 in the morning with no reason to go back inside quickly because no one would notice either way. He opened his laptop. The Henderson proposal blinked at him from the browser, red-flagged in Brian's shared notes deadline tomorrow. He looked at it for a full 30 seconds. Then he minimized it and opened a different tab and started looking at what a meal delivery service would cost and how far Maple Drive was from the 3 grocery stores within reasonable distance of the house, and which of those stores had a good prepared food section for someone who might not feel like cooking, and which days of the week the library's reading program ran, and whether the community center on Elm had any programs for adults over 60 that might be worth mentioning on Saturday, casually, the way you mention things when you wanted to plant an idea without making it feel like a prescription. He would go to the recital. He would take Ruth. He would introduce her to Lily, and Lily would ask Ruth 15 questions inside of 4 minutes. And Ruth would answer all of them with the genuine attention of a woman who had spent 35 years learning to be present for small people with large curiosities. And then they would go to dinner, and he would listen to Ruth actually talk, not perform talking, and at some point he would bring up the meal service and the garden and the book club in the careful way he'd learned to bring up things that mattered, the way you approached something that a person needed but hadn't yet decided to want. He was not doing this because he was a good person. He'd given up on that framing somewhere around year 3 of single fatherhood, which had a way of stripping the narrative prettiness off your motivations. He was doing this because a 4-second pause in a voicemail had opened something he'd been keeping closed, and because his 5-year-old daughter had reminded him at a puzzle table that old friends already knew when you left, and because Eleanor Webb had stood at her window at 2 in the morning, watching a woman stand alone in the dark, and had spent 6 weeks figuring out who to call, and had called him, had reached through the address book by the telephone and pulled out his name of all names, and that meant something he was going to have to be worthy of. He closed the laptop. He started the car. He pulled out of the school parking lot and drove toward the Harmon building and the Henderson proposal and Brian's red-flagged notes and the ordinary machinery of the day. But the lavender, he thought. Next time he came to Maple Drive, he was going to bring lavender for the garden. Ruth had grown it along the back fence years ago. He remembered it from summer visits, the smell of it in the evenings when they'd sat on the back porch after dinner, Gary's laugh carrying over the yard. Something that could go back in the ground. Something that would take time to establish, that would look like very little for a while before it became what it was supposed to be. Something worth waiting for. Saturday arrived the way important days sometimes did, quietly, without ceremony. The light through Cal's kitchen window, just light, the coffee, just coffee. Nothing announcing itself as significant. Lily had been awake since 5:45. He knew this because at 5:46 she had appeared in his doorway in her purple dress, fully clothed shoes, already on holding her toothbrush as evidence that she was handling the morning with maximum efficiency and required no assistance. She'd practiced her recital piece 3 times at the kitchen table before breakfast, 2 fingers tracing the melody on the wood surface, her lips moving silently through the counting. By the time Cal had scrambled eggs, she'd run through it twice more, standing at the counter watching her reflection in the darkened microwave door like it was an audience she needed to convince. In the car she sat with her hands folded in her lap, which was not her natural posture. Lily in motion was elbows and questions, and the particular energy of a person for whom stillness required active expenditure. The folded hands were the physical equivalent of held breath. What if I forget in the middle? The question came out measured like she'd been rationing it since 5:46. You stop. You breathe. You start again from where you remember. Cal kept his eyes on the road. That's the whole job. What if my hands shake? Then they shake and you play anyway. Shaking hands can still find the right keys. Lily absorbed this. A mile passed. Did you ever have to do something scared? He thought about the morning he'd signed the divorce papers, his hand moving across the page with a steadiness that surprised him, because nothing else in his body felt steady. He thought about the first night Lily had slept under his roof alone, just the 2 of them, the apartment so quiet he'd checked her breathing 4 times before midnight. More times than I can count, he said. The scared feeling doesn't mean stop. It means you care about getting it right. Lily looked out the window at the passing streets. Mrs. Ruth is going to be there. She said she would. Good. Lily's hands unfolded slightly in her lap. I want someone there who knows what it's like to be nervous in front of people. Cal thought about that for the rest of the drive. The community center parking lot was already filling when they arrived at 1:30. Cal spotted Ruth before Lily did. She was standing near the entrance in a navy blazer over a floral dress, her gray hair pinned back with more care than the ponytail she'd worn on Sunday, and she was watching the families stream past her with the expression of someone who had arrived early to avoid the sensation of entering a room already in progress. She looked up when Cal raised a hand, and something in her posture changed a small but visible, releasing the body's version of exhaling. Lily saw her and walked directly across the lobby without hesitation, the quality of her approach more assessment than greeting, the focused attention she brought to anything she'd been thinking about in advance. She stopped in front of Ruth and looked up. "Are you Mrs. Ruth?" "I am." Ruth's voice steady and warm, the voice of 35 years in second grade, a voice engineered for making small people feel the ground under their feet. "Daddy says you know how to listen." Lily's tone indicated this was the relevant credential. "Are you good at it? I spent most of my career listening to people smaller than you explain things they cared about deeply. I'd like to think I got reasonably good at it." Lily considered this assessment with the gravity it deserved. Then, "You can sit next to Daddy, but don't talk during the performance. That's the rule." "Understood," Ruth said, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile but was clearly its precursor. They found seats 4 rows from the front, Ruth on Cal's left and aisle to his right. The community center's recital room was the kind of space that tried hard and mostly succeeded: good acoustic tile chairs that didn't squeak, a small raised platform at the front with an upright piano that had been tuned recently enough. Parents arranged themselves with the focused energy of people who had been looking forward to this and were slightly terrified on someone else's behalf. Cal recognized 2 fathers from Lily's school by the identical expressions they wore: pride in advance, anxiety on behalf, the particular cocktail of parenting a child who was about to do something publicly. Lily sat between Cal and Ruth for the first 20 minutes through the welcome remarks and the first 3 performances. A boy in a blue shirt played his piece with mechanical precision and no apparent enjoyment. A girl in yellow played beautifully, but at half the indicated tempo, her face serene with total concentration. A child whose name Cal missed rushed through everything so quickly the melody became rhythm. Lily watched all 3 with the focused attention of someone gathering data. By the 5th performer, Cal could feel the tension radiating off her. Not the theatrical anxiety of a child performing distress, but the real thing, the body's genuine response to genuine stakes. Her hands were back in her lap, and the folding had returned tighter this time. Ruth leaned slightly toward her, not enough to draw attention, her voice low enough to be private. "Can I tell you something I used to do before choir concerts?" Lily's eyes cut sideways. She didn't move her head. "I used to tell myself the scared feeling wasn't a warning. I told myself it was proof that I cared about doing the thing well, and caring about something well, that's not a problem to solve. That's just what it feels like to be serious about something." Lily processed this for a long moment, watching the 6th performer take the bench. "Did it work?" "Sometimes, but I showed up every single time. That part always worked." Cal kept his eyes on the stage, but he was aware of Lily beside him, absorbing this, fitting it somewhere useful inside herself. When Mrs. Henderson called Lily's name, Lily stood in one clean motion, smoothed her purple dress with both hands, and walked to the piano bench with her back straight and her chin level, the posture of someone who had made a decision and was honoring it with her spine. She adjusted the bench, placed her hands on the keys. The room did what rooms did. At these moments it held its collective breath, parents and siblings and grandparents, all briefly unified in the particular suspense of watching a small person prepare to do something that mattered to them. Cal's hands were laced together in his lap, hard enough to whiten his knuckles, and he made himself loosen them. Lily sat still for 4 full seconds. Then she closed her eyes, took a breath that Cal could see from the 4th row, and began. She played the opening carefully, each note deliberate, the tempo slightly slower than in practice, but solid her small fingers finding the keys with the concentration of someone for whom this was not yet automatic, but would be. Halfway through the second section, she hit a wrong note. A clean, clear mistake, impossible to miss, the kind that landed in the quiet room like something dropped. The music stopped. Cal stopped breathing. The silence lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3. Long enough for the room to register it, for several parents to exchange the quick glance of people who knew what was coming and were bracing. Then Lily did exactly what he had told her. She sat still. She breathed visibly, that same deliberate breath from the beginning, found her place in the music, and continued. She played the remainder of the piece without another error, the tempo, if anything, slightly more confident in the final section, as though clearing the obstacle had settled something. When she finished, the applause was the warm and genuine kind. Not the polite kind, not the relieved kind, but the kind that recognized something real had just happened. Lily executed her bow with the formal precision she'd practiced in the bathroom mirror, and walked back to her seat, where she grabbed both Cal and Ruth by the hand simultaneously and leaned forward between them. "I messed up, and I kept going." Cal's throat was doing something inconvenient. "That's the whole job, Lily." Ruth's hand tightened on Lily's just briefly, and her voice when she spoke was quieter than before, carrying something in it that wasn't quite steady. "That's the whole job." Cal heard what she meant underneath what she said. He didn't look at her directly. He just let the moment be what it was. The diner Lily had selected for the celebration was a local institution of chrome and red vinyl, the kind of place that had been the same for 30 years and was proud of it. Carol, whose name tag had a small star sticker on it that a child had clearly placed there, and that Carol had clearly decided to leave, took their orders with the efficient warmth of someone who had seen several thousand family dinners and still found them interesting. Lily ordered grilled cheese and chocolate milk with the confidence of someone who had thought about this in advance. Ruth ordered a club sandwich. Cal ordered a burger and watched his daughter climb into the booth across from Ruth and begin the formal process of assessment. For the first several minutes, Lily reported on the recital in comprehensive detail, every performer, her analysis of their technique, the specific texture of her own fear during the 4-second silence, and what it had felt like to push through it. Ruth listened with the complete attention she'd described in the lobby, not performing interest, but actually attending, asking questions that indicated she'd heard the previous sentence. Cal ate and watched and said very little. Then Lily put down half her grilled cheese and looked at Ruth with the directness that had stopped being surprising and started being simply how she operated. "Do you live by yourself?" "I do." "Is it quiet all the time?" Ruth's hand stilled slightly around her coffee cup just for a moment. "Most of the time, yes." Lily chewed this along with her sandwich. "When Daddy's working late and I can't sleep, I listen to the cars going past outside, so the quiet isn't the whole thing." She paused. "You could do that. Listen to the cars." Ruth looked at this 5-year-old offering a genuine solution to a genuine problem, and something moved through her expression that Cal recognized as the sensation of being unexpectedly understood. "That's a good idea," Ruth said, not patronizing, meaning it. "We should do this every 2 weeks, Lily announced with the tone she used for conclusions she'd already reached before saying them aloud. "Because you're part of our family now, and family eats dinner together." The table went quiet in a different way than the concert hall had gone quiet. Cal looked at Lily, who was eating her grilled cheese again, matter resolved. He looked at Ruth, whose hand around the coffee cup had tightened in the way that hands tightened when a person was keeping their face from doing something they weren't ready to do publicly. "Every other Saturday," Cal said. "Standing appointment." Ruth set the coffee cup down carefully. "I'll put it on my calendar," she said, her voice doing the thing it did when she was holding 2 things at once, the effort of steadiness, and underneath it, something that was either grief or gratitude, and was probably both. Carol came by with refills. Lily described Professor Feathers, the chicken she intended to hold at next week's farm field trip and had already named. Cal watched Ruth's face across the table, The animation in it, the real attention she gave Lily's account of poultry naming philosophy, the way being needed to listen, was visibly doing something for her that an hour of polite conversation hadn't. This was what Eleanor had described. Not care exactly. Being in the presence of someone who required your full attention, who took your responses seriously, who treated you as a person whose opinions on chicken nomenclature were worth having. The check came. Cal paid. Outside on the sidewalk, Lily took Ruth's hand without asking the spontaneous claiming of someone who had decided a thing and saw no reason for ceremony about it. "Same place in 2 weeks?" Lily asked. "Same place," Ruth confirmed. Driving home with Lily asleep in the back seat before they'd cleared the parking lot, Cal thought about the expression on Ruth's face when Lily had announced she was family. The careful handling of it. The cost of hoping for someone who'd been practicing not to. Monday arrived with Brian Taft waiting at Cal's office door at 8:15, which was Brian's version of an urgent notice. Brian was a precise man in his 50s who had built his half of the partnership on the conviction that success was arithmetic, inputs, outputs, variables you controlled, and variables you eliminated. He sat across from Cal's desk and placed a printed report on the surface between them, which was Brian's way of ensuring the conversation stayed factual. The Henderson account, response time metrics, 2 revision cycles on a proposal that Cal had historically turned in clean, 3 client calls where the account lead Cal had been, in the client's words, less engaged than we're used to. "This isn't a performance issue yet," Brian said. "I want to address it before it becomes one." "I hear you. Whatever's pulling your focus outside of this office." Brian paused in the way he paused when he was selecting words for precision rather than feeling, "You need to either resolve it or compartmentalize it. We have a client who pays 8% of our annual revenue, and they are beginning to notice." Cal looked at the report. The metrics were accurate. He had been less engaged in the specific way that Brian had identified, not performing badly but not performing like himself. Present in body processing in a different room. He knew this. He'd known it for 2 weeks. "Can I ask you something?" Cal kept his voice level, not combative. "Your mother, what did she do last Sunday?" Brian's expression shifted into the particular stillness of someone who hadn't expected the conversation to move this direction. "What? Your mother. Do you know where she was last Sunday? What she ate? Whether she was doing all right?" "She lives in Scottsdale." Brian's voice had the careful neutrality of a man who did not discuss his personal life at work, including with his business partner of 11 years. "She's fine." "You know that because you verified it, or because it's easier to assume and the assumption has never been tested?" Silence. Brian was not a man who left silences unfilled without intention, which meant the silence was the answer. Cal didn't press it. He picked up the Henderson report and said he'd have the revised proposal to Brian by Thursday, that he'd reach out to the client directly with an apology for the response time lag, that he'd handle it. Brian nodded, picked up his copy of the report, and left. At the door he stopped without turning around. "Whatever it is, don't let it cost us the account, Cal." "I won't," Cal said. And then he sat at his desk for a moment after Brian left, looking at the Henderson report, thinking about a woman in Scottsdale who was probably fine, and thinking about what probably meant, and thinking about how long you could coast on an assumption before it stopped being reasonable. He called Marcus that afternoon from his car in the parking garage, the same oil-stained concrete and afternoon light, as if the geography were deliberately rhyming with itself. Marcus answered on the third ring with the slightly compressed voice of a man multitasking background noise of a busy floor. Cal didn't build toward it. He said what he'd learned: the fridge, Eleanor's email, the book club Ruth hadn't been to in 6 weeks, the calendar in the kitchen, the specific quality of emptiness that gathered in a house when it had stopped being lived in and started being waited in. He kept his voice factual, the way he'd have described a security vulnerability to a client, not to alarm, but to make the stakes legible. Marcus went quiet after the part about the fridge, a different quality of quiet than the multitasking silence before. Then, "She never told me any of that." "She wouldn't. She's been managing your comfort at the expense of her own for long enough that she doesn't distinguish between the two anymore." Another silence. When Marcus spoke again, the professionalism in his voice had been replaced by something rawer and less managed. "So, what am I supposed to do? Cal, I have a department of 22 people and a project that's been hemorrhaging timeline for 3 months. I can't just—" "I'm not asking you to quit anything." Cal kept his voice level. "I'm asking you to call her tonight. When she tells you she's fine, I need you to say, 'I know you're fine. I want to know how you actually are.' Those are different questions. She needs you to know the difference." "I'll think about it." The words landed with the soft thud of an intention that might not survive contact with the next morning's calendar. Cal felt something he hadn't planned to feel. A clean, quiet anger, not at Marcus exactly, but at the whole grammar of later, the whole architecture of, "I'll get to it," the way people conjugated their love in the future tense until there wasn't enough future left to conjugate into. "She's 63 and she's eating crackers for dinner," Cal said. "And she's protecting you from knowing it because she doesn't want to be a burden to the son she raised. Stop thinking." He hung up before Marcus could respond. His hands were not quite steady on the steering wheel, and he sat with that for a moment, recognizing it as something beyond frustration. Recognition may be the particular rawness of seeing in someone else a version of what you'd done yourself and finding it less forgivable from the outside. 5 days passed. Marcus didn't call back. Cal checked his phone with a frequency that annoyed him, this involuntary monitoring of a conversation he couldn't control. He visited Ruth on Wednesday with groceries. He'd told himself he was already planning to buy organic soup, actual produce, the good bread from the bakery on 5th she'd mentioned once years ago. That was still there. He let himself in through the back door Ruth had started leaving unlocked on his visiting days, called her name, found her in the living room with a library book. While she made tea, he put the groceries away, and the picture became clear in the way that clear pictures did gradually, and then all at once. The fridge held half a carton of milk, a jar of peanut butter at the bottom, 4 eggs, a container of soup so old it should have been discarded already, the pantry crackers, 1 can of beans, a nearly empty box of cereal. Ruth came into the kitchen doorway and saw him standing at the open fridge. She said nothing, which was itself a kind of admission. He closed the fridge and turned around. He sat at the kitchen table. He waited until she sat across from him. "I want to tell you something honestly," he said. "When I came back 3 weeks ago, I came because I felt guilty. Not because I was a good person. Because I couldn't stop hearing a 4-second pause on a voicemail without doing something about it, and because my 5-year-old said something at a puzzle table that I couldn't argue with." He kept his eyes on her face. "I'm telling you this because I don't want you to think I came out of pity or obligation. I came for a small reason and a complicated one. But I'm staying for a different reason entirely. You matter to me. You mattered before I walked back through that door. I just needed reminding of a thing I already knew." Ruth looked at him across the kitchen table for a long moment. Her face was doing several things simultaneously, none of them simple. Then, "You know what the difference is between you and Marcus?" He waited. "You showed up," she said, not as accusation toward Marcus, as simple earned fact. The difference between a word and an action was the same as the difference between a map and the territory one described the other, but only one of them was real. He scheduled the doctor's appointment himself, and told her 2 days in advance, which gave her enough time to accept it without enough time to talk herself out of it. He drove her on a Thursday morning the office of Dr. Carol Hayes, a direct woman in her mid-50s who had clearly built her practice on the conviction that vagueness cost patients more than honesty did. Dr. Hayes reviewed Ruth's chart with an expression that required no translation, asked her questions in the flat factual tone of someone assembling evidence, and then delivered her findings the same way. Low blood pressure, mild anemia, vitamin deficiencies that told a specific story about eating patterns over the past several months, not weeks. The kind of results that existed in the clinical space between not sick and heading somewhere serious if the variables didn't change. "Your body isn't failing," Dr. Hayes said to Ruth, "but it's reflecting what you've been giving it, which from what I can see hasn't been very much." She paused. "Are you eating regular meals?" Ruth held her hands in her lap. "I eat when I think of it." "And how often do you think of it?" Silence. Dr. Hayes turned to Cal not unkindly with the practiced assessment of someone who'd had this conversation in many configurations. "Is there support at home?" Ruth glanced at Cal. Something passed across her face that he hadn't seen before, not quite relief, but adjacent to it, the expression of someone who could answer a question honestly for the first time in a while. "There is now," she said. In the car afterward, Ruth watched the streets pass without speaking. Cal drove without filling the silence, which was one of the few things he'd gotten genuinely better at since Lily, the discipline of not reaching for noise when quiet was doing its work. After several blocks, Ruth said, "I want to go back to book club." He said, "Okay." "I want to call Patrice, my daughter. I've been letting her believe everything is fine." A pause. "That's not fair to her. It hasn't been fair to her." "No," Cal agreed. "But you can change that." "It's the hardest one," Ruth said, not asking for disagreement, just naming it accurately. "I know," Cal said. "That's probably why it's the right place to start." Ruth looked out the window at a stretch of ordinary street, a dry cleaner, a hardware store, a woman walking a dog the size of a footstool. The ordinary geography of a Tuesday morning in a mid-size American city. "I stopped thinking of myself as worth maintaining," she said finally, and her voice was very quiet and very steady, the voice of someone who had gotten to the bottom of something and found it easier to say than expected. "That's what the doctor was describing in there. Not a medical problem. A decision I made without knowing I was making it." Cal kept his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road. "Then make a different one," he said. And because it wasn't advice or reassurance but simply the accurate description of what was available to her, she didn't push back. The call from Marcus came on a Thursday morning at 7:12, 9 days after their conversation in the parking garage. Cal was making Lily's lunch and his phone lit up on the counter with Marcus's name. He answered it while spreading peanut butter. Marcus's voice was different. Not the office voice, not the managed voice. Something stripped of its professional coating. "I'm at Denver International. 6:15 flight." A pause in which Cal could hear the ambient noise of a terminal. "I should have done this months ago. I'm not calling for credit. I just thought you should know." Cal set down the peanut butter knife. "Does she know you're coming?" "I was going to surprise her." "Call her from the gate," Cal said. "Let her know before you land. She needs a little time to prepare for being happy she's been practicing the other thing for a while. Don't ambush her with good news. Give her a chance to meet it." A long pause. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had a different quality. Humbled maybe, or just quieted. "Yeah, okay, that's yeah." Then, "Thank you, Cal." "Thank her," Cal said. "All of this started because she kept a picture of the two of us from your graduation, all these years. She kept it." He hung up and stood at the kitchen counter. Lily appeared in the doorway, dressed backpack on, watching him with the bright attention she brought to anything she correctly identified as significant. Was that someone important? Yes. Good news or fixing news? Cal thought about that distinction for a moment. "Both," he said. "The kind where the fixing is the good news." Lily nodded as though this confirmed something she'd suspected. "Is Mrs. Ruth going to be okay?" "She's getting there." "Are you—" The question landed without warning, the way Lily's questions did, not maliciously, not with any sense of the ground they covered, just honestly the way a 5-year-old asked the question that the adults in the room had been carefully not asking each other. Cal looked at his daughter in the kitchen doorway in her purple backpack with her dinosaur keychain and her completely undefended directness. He thought about the Henderson proposal sitting on his desk with Brian's notes in red. He thought about the 4-second pause on the voicemail and the cold coffee and Eleanor standing at her window in the dark watching a woman who didn't know she was being watched. He thought about a recliner with an impression in it that no one had sat in for 4 years. "Yeah, Lily," he said. "I think I am." She seemed satisfied. She went to get her lunch from the counter, and he stood for a moment in the kitchen in the ordinary morning light, in the middle of an ordinary Thursday, understanding with the particular clarity that ordinary moments sometimes produced that he had been substituting efficiency for presence for long enough that he'd stopped noticing the difference. Work had been the thing he was best at, and being best at something was a reasonable substitute for being fully alive until it wasn't. He had a daughter who asked him if he was getting there, and he had said yes, and he meant it, and meaning it was going to cost something, and he was done with the kind of accounting that made him weigh that cost. Brian called at 11 with the news that Henderson had formally requested a different account lead. The decision had been made, communicated professionally, and was not personal. Brian's word, though what impersonal meant in this context, Cal wasn't entirely sure. The account would transfer to their associate director. 8% of annual revenue assigned to someone else, because Cal had been present in body and somewhere else entirely for 3 weeks running, and a client with options had noticed. Brian said, "I want you to understand the impact of what happened here." "I do," Cal said. "I hope whatever it was worth it." Cal looked out his office window at the Harmon Building's view parking lot, the roof of the dry cleaner on 5th, a stretch of afternoon sky going gold at the edges. He thought about a recital and a back booth at a diner and a calendar stuck in November that someone needed to take down and replace. He thought about a fridge that was full now and a doctor's appointment attended and a flight departing from Denver International that morning. He thought about what worth it meant in an accounting system that didn't run on revenue. "Yeah," he said. "I think it was." He closed his laptop after Brian hung up and looked at his phone. A text from his assistant, Ohio Hospital Network, interested in a proposal found merit security through a referral from a former client. Smaller than Henderson. Exactly the kind of account Cal had started this company to work with. He picked up the phone. That evening he put Lily to bed at 8:15, the normal ritual of water and blanket adjustment, and 2 minutes of recap of the day's events. Lily reported on the farm field trip, which had been extraordinary, and on Professor Feathers specifically, who had been smaller than expected, but very dignified daddy, you could just tell. She was asleep before he'd finished his sentence about dinosaur dignity. He stood in her doorway for a moment the way he often did, not for any specific reason, just for the act of standing there, the particular kind of certainty it provided. Then he went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and stood at the window looking at the parking lot below and the streetlights and the cars and the ordinary machinery of a Thursday night in a mid-size American city, and felt with unusual clarity exactly where he was. His phone buzzed. "Marcus." "Landed." She cried when she opened the door. "I think I did too. Don't tell anyone." Then a minute later, "I'm staying the week." Cal set the phone face down on the counter. Outside, a car pulled in and 2 people got out laughing about something, their voices carrying up faintly through the glass. The streetlight on the corner threw its usual amber across the pavement. Everything was exactly ordinary, and he was exactly present in it, which was not something he could have said 3 weeks ago. He thought about the lavender he still hadn't brought. He'd go this weekend. Something small, something that needed time to become what it was supposed to be. Marcus Hadley, at 36, had the look of a man who had been running hard in a single direction for long enough that stopping felt like a physical risk. He stood in Ruth's front doorway on a Thursday morning with a carry-on bag at his feet and an expression that wanted to be composed and wasn't quite making it. Ruth had known he was coming. Cal's advice, the gate call, the small gift of preparation. But knowing and seeing were different instruments, and she stood in the doorway holding the frame with one hand, the way she'd held it the day Cal had come back, that same careful management of herself, the body's instinct to brace against something that might be good. Marcus said, "I moved some things around." Ruth looked at her son, the height of him, the tired eyes, the suit jacket he was still wearing because he'd come straight from the airport, because the thought of stopping at a hotel first had apparently not been acceptable to whatever version of himself had booked the ticket. She stepped back and opened the door wider and said the thing she'd been saying to people she loved for 63 years when words weren't big enough for the occasion. "Come in, you look thin. I'm making lunch." He followed her into the kitchen. Something happened in there that didn't require narration, the recovery of a particular grammar, a mother and her adult son finding the register they'd spoken in before work and distance, and the practiced administration of guilt had overlaid it. Marcus sat at the counter the way he'd sat at 15 doing homework, while Ruth moved around him, and she moved without self-consciousness because he was there, and she didn't have to perform for him, which was its own kind of relief. They talked while her hands were occupied the sideways approach to honesty that families used when direct approach carried too much exposure. Marcus said, "I told myself you were fine because it was easier than finding out you weren't." His voice was flat with the specific flatness of a man making himself say a true thing without softening it into something more comfortable. Ruth kept her hands moving on the counter. "I know. I'm sorry, Mom. I know that too." She set down what she was holding and turned to look at him fully, the way she'd looked at students who needed to hear something important rather than something reassuring. "I'm not interested in apologies on their own. They're the beginning of something, not the thing itself." Marcus looked at his mother and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Tell me what I missed. Not the summary, what actually happened." She told him. Not the managed version, not the version organized around his comfort. The real chronology the first winter after Gary, how the house had seemed to contract around her in a way she hadn't predicted and hadn't known how to describe. The book club. The garden. The meals she'd started skipping, not out of illness, but out of a gradual disinvestment in her own daily requirements that had happened so slowly she hadn't identified it as a pattern until Dr. Hayes had laid the evidence on a table. She told him about the bedroom door, how she'd been sleeping in the living room for 2 years. She told him about standing in the backyard that night in the dark, which she knew Eleanor had seen because Eleanor had mentioned it obliquely weeks later, with the careful indirection of someone who didn't want to cause alarm but needed to register concern. Marcus was quiet through all of it. When she finished, he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have worried," Ruth said simply. "And worrying without acting would have made you feel worse and changed nothing. I was protecting you from the discomfort of knowing." "That's not Mom, that's not your job. That stopped being your job a long time ago." Old habits. She said it without self-pity, just the frank acknowledgement of a woman who had spent enough years in the architecture of a specific role that some of its load-bearing walls had become invisible to her. The lemon chicken was Marcus's idea, which meant it wasn't just about food. It never was. It was the dish Ruth had made on Sunday evenings through his entire childhood, the one he'd attempted to recreate in his Denver apartment with consistent near success, and never quite right, always missing something he couldn't identify in the recipe because the thing it was missing wasn't an ingredient. He asked her to teach him properly, and she understood what the request actually was, not a cooking lesson, but a reclamation of something they'd let sit in storage too long. They stood at the counter together for 2 hours. Ruth instructed, and Marcus made mistakes with the knife work, and she corrected him not impatiently, and he asked questions that ranged from technical to not technical at all. He asked about her mother, his grandmother, the woman whose photograph sat on the bookshelf in the living room and who Marcus had known only through second-hand description. Ruth told him about a woman who had been stubborn and practical and had expressed love primarily through action, who had thought sentiment was something you demonstrated rather than declared. She said, "You have her eyebrows. I noticed it when you were about 12 and I never told you." Marcus looked at her. "Why not?" "I don't know. Sometimes you hold things because they feel too tender to handle in ordinary conversation." She turned back to the stove. "That was a mistake. The tender things are the ones worth handling." The chicken went into the oven. Marcus leaned against the counter and watched his mother move through her kitchen and said, "I have a lot of catching up to do." "We both do," Ruth said. "But we're here now. That's not nothing." Cal's knock came at 6 on Saturday, but Lily had already pushed the front door open before the knock finished because she'd seen the car in the driveway from the passenger window and considered the knock a formality at best. She came through the front door, stopped in the kitchen doorway, and raised her nose with the theatrical precision of someone who had decided to make this a performance. "This house smells different today," she announced. Marcus looked at Cal. Cal lifted one shoulder. "Don't fight it." "Different how?" Ruth's voice carried from the stove, amused before she even turned around. Lily considered the question with the gravity she brought to factual inquiry. Like someone's actually cooking, not soup from a can cooking, real cooking. Marcus made a sound that came out as genuine laughter, unguarded, caught off guard by the accuracy of a 5-year-old's nose, and Ruth turned from the stove with an expression Cal had been waiting weeks to see, the expression of a woman who was not performing happiness, but simply having it, the unguarded kind, the kind that moved through the eyes first. Eleanor Webb arrived at 6:30 with a bottle of wine she'd been keeping for an occasion that justified it, which she announced in the specific tone of someone who had decided the occasion had arrived and was mildly defiant about having waited so long. She settled at Ruth's kitchen table with the ease of someone who had been in the room before, which she had casseroles, check-ins, the quiet neighboring that had been the closest thing Ruth had to regular human contact for longer than anyone in the room wanted to calculate. They ate in the dining room, 5 people around a table that had spent several years hosting one. Marcus had made the lemon chicken with Ruth directing, and the result was close enough to the original that when Lily tasted it, she looked up with an expression of serious professional approval. Eleanor told a story about her late husband's only attempt at cooking a Thanksgiving dinner that had resulted in a fire department visit and a lasting family prohibition, and Marcus laughed so hard he had to put his fork down. And Ruth watched her son laugh at Eleanor's table with an expression that Cal recognized as the expression of someone receiving something they had stopped expecting. Lily, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the focused attention she brought to anything that seemed important, turned to Marcus midway through dinner and asked, "Are you going to visit more now?" The table did a collective small stillness. Marcus looked at this 5-year-old who had asked the question all the adults had been moving around and said, "Yes, I am." "Good." Lily returned to her chicken. "Because your mom needs people around. Quiet houses are okay sometimes, but not all the time." Marcus looked at Cal across the table. Cal looked back. Something passed between them that didn't require articulation. The shared recognition of 2 men who had arrived at the same understanding from different directions at different speeds, and were both sitting with the particular mixture of relief and regret that came with having gotten somewhere important later than you should have. After dinner, while Lily helped Eleanor search the living room for an earring that had come undone during the meal. Approaching the task with the systematic methodology of a 5-year-old forensic investigator, Cal and Marcus stood on the back porch. The evening was warm and still, the yard holding the last of the day's light. The back fence where Ruth's lavender had grown years ago was bare not for much longer, Cal thought. "How long did it take?" Marcus asked. "For her to seem like herself?" Cal considered the question. "She's not herself again. She's something after herself. The person you become when you've gone through something that changes the layout, and then you learn to navigate the new layout. It takes longer to arrive at, but it's more stable." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I'm booking a monthly visit. Already told my assistant to block it. Non-negotiable." He paused. "And a weekly call. Not a check-in, an actual conversation. Like we had when I was in college and called her every Sunday because I hadn't figured out yet that I was supposed to stop needing to." "Tell her," Cal said. "Not me." Marcus went inside. Through the glass door, Cal watched him cross to where Ruth was stacking plates and say something to her, watched her hands stop moving, watched her turn to look at her son with an expression that was private enough that Cal looked away. The following Monday, the Ohio hospital proposal went out. Cal had spent most of Sunday on it, the focused, productive kind of Sunday he hadn't had in weeks, the work coming cleanly because he wasn't using it to fill something. Brian acknowledged receipt with a 2-line email that was professionally warm, in the way Brian was warm when he was making an effort. The Henderson account was gone. The space it left was real, and Cal didn't pretend otherwise, but space was also what you needed before you could build something new in a place, and he'd been in the construction business long enough to know that the foundation mattered more than the timeline. 3 weeks after Marcus's visit on a Tuesday afternoon, Cal stopped by Maple Drive with groceries and found the house doing something it hadn't done during any of his previous visits. It was quiet in a different way. not the heavy quiet of a space in which living had stopped, but the lighter quiet of a space resting between activities. Ruth's gardening gloves were on the porch railing. Her library bag was by the front door, which meant she'd been to the reading program that morning. The mail Cal checked out of habit had been taken in. He found her in the kitchen with a cup of tea and a book she was actually reading, not holding. She looked up when he came in and said, "There's more tea if you want it." He put the groceries away. The fridge held actual food produce leftovers in labeled containers, a full carton of eggs, the evidence of someone feeding herself with intention. When he came back to the table, she was watching him with an expression that was partly amused and partly something softer. "You checked the fridge," she said. "Habit." "It's a good habit," Ruth said without embarrassment. "Keep it." He sat across from her. She told him about book club she'd gone back the previous Tuesday, and Margot Baines had embraced her in the parking lot before she'd even gotten through the door, and they'd spent the first 15 minutes not discussing the book at all, just talking, and Ruth had driven home afterward feeling a particular kind of tired that she'd told Cal was the good kind, the kind that came from having actually used yourself. She told him about the library reading program, about a boy named Aaron who was 9 and hadn't been able to read past a second-grade level, and who had in the past 3 weeks made a specific kind of progress that manifested less in test scores than in the way he sat down at the table with her, the shift from braced to open. She talked about Aaron with the precision and care of a woman for whom this kind of work had never stopped being the right work. Then she stopped talking and looked at her tea. "I talked to Patrice," she said. Cal waited. Really talked. 2 hours. She knew something was wrong. She said she'd been feeling it for months, that I seemed fine, but the way I seemed fine felt performed. She's been worried and not saying it because she thought saying it would upset me. Ruth paused. "We've been protecting each other from the truth for a year at least. Maybe longer." She set the cup down. "She's coming in August. 3 weeks. She and David both. How do you feel about that?" Ruth considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Relieved, embarrassed that it took this long, grateful. She paused. "And I want to have the garden looking better by then. Not perfect, I gave up on perfect when Gary died, but alive, the way it's supposed to look." Which was how the following Saturday became what it became. Cal arrived at 9 with 2 flats of lavender from the nursery on Route 9, which had required a conversation with a woman named Donna, who knew more about lavender varieties than Cal had known existed, and who had opinions about soil preparation that she shared with the conviction of someone who had been waiting for this consultation. Eleanor appeared at 9:15 apparently without being invited, in the comfortable way she'd started appearing, as though her presence had been assumed even when it hadn't been explicitly arranged. She was wearing canvas pants and work gloves, and she moved through Ruth's back gate with the purposeful ease of someone who had grown up doing this kind of work and hadn't forgotten the vocabulary of it. Lily arrived with Cal and immediately demanded assignment. Eleanor, without missing a beat, gave her the job of patting down the soil around each planted seedling to make sure they feel secure, Eleanor said with the same seriousness Lily brought to important tasks, and Lily received this job with the gravity it deserved and commenced operations. They worked through the morning. Cal dug the real work of it, the ground having hardened over a season of neglect and needing to be convinced back into use. Eleanor directed with the confidence of someone whose directions were worth following, and Cal followed them without argument because they were. Ruth planted her hands, moving with an ease in the soil that indicated this was remembered work, the body retaining what the mind had set aside, the muscle memory of someone who had done this for years and was doing it again. At a certain point, Ruth straightened up and pushed her hair off her face with the back of her wrist, a gesture so ordinary and so completely unself-conscious that it landed on Cal with unexpected weight. She was simply a woman working in her garden on a Saturday morning, and for the first time in the months he'd been coming to Maple Drive, he understood that this, not the dinner conversations, or the doctor's appointments, or the careful check-ins, was what recovery looked like in the body. Not a moment of declaration. Just a woman with dirt on her gloves, upright, working present. Ruth said, "Gary always claimed he couldn't understand why I loved lavender." Said it smelled like old ladies. She was looking at the row they'd planted along the back fence. He was wrong about that, and at least 3 other things I never got around to telling him. Eleanor, kneeling in the dirt 8 feet away, made a short, decisive sound. Men usually are. "Hey," Cal said. "I said usually," Eleanor said. "I made no categorical claims." Lily looked up from her padding assessment, complete on that exchange. She leaned toward the nearest lavender plant and inhaled with the focus of someone performing an official sensory evaluation. Her face went through several stages: concentration, recognition without memory, the particular expression of encountering something for the first time that the body somehow already knows. "I like it," she said. Her voice was certain and quiet. "It smells like when something's going to be okay." Nobody spoke for a moment. Ruth was looking at Lily with an expression that Cal had been watching develop across weeks. Not the warmth she'd shown from the beginning, which had been genuine but held slightly in reserve, but something fuller and less guarded, the expression of someone who had decided fully that this was real and could be trusted with her full attention. Cal understood, watching her, that what he'd been doing these months was not rescuing Ruth Hadley. Eleanor had been right about the word from the beginning. Ruth had not needed rescuing. She'd needed to matter, which was a different request entirely, one that asked less of the other person and more because mattering couldn't be provided the way assistance could. It had to be genuine or it was nothing. And whatever had grown in this kitchen and this back garden over the past months was genuine, which meant it would hold. That evening, after Eleanor had gone home with the satisfied air of someone who'd done an honest day's work, and after Marcus had video-called from Denver to see the finished garden and had said, "Mom, that's beautiful," with a simplicity that suggested he'd given up on sounding casual about things that moved him, and after Lily had fallen asleep in the living room at 8:15 with impressive abruptness, as though her body had simply filed the day as complete and shut off, after all of that, Cal and Ruth sat on the back porch. The light was doing the gold thing it did on summer evenings in this part of the country, the long, slow descent that stretched the shadows without dramatizing them. The lavender row along the back fence was small and new and not much to look at yet. In spring, it would be different. Ruth was looking at it in the specific way of a gardener who could see what wasn't there yet. "Can I ask you something?" Ruth's voice was easy, not portentous. "Yeah." "Why did you actually come back? Not the version with Marcus's voicemail. The version underneath that one." Cal looked at the lavender, then at the fence board that still needed replacing, then at the yard in the gold evening light. He'd been turning this question over since April, trying to find the bottom of it. "Lily told me at a puzzle table that old friends need more visits than new ones because they already know you left." He paused. "She said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world, and I sat there and couldn't think of a reason she was wrong." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "That's a good reason. It's a small one." "Small reasons are the honest ones," Ruth said. "The big reasons are usually constructed after the fact to make the small ones sound more deliberate." She looked at the garden. "When you came back that first Sunday, I almost didn't open the door. I stood in the hallway and I thought, if I open this door and I let myself care about whoever is there, and then they leave again, I don't know if I can do that again." She paused. "I opened it anyway." "I know," Cal said. "I could see it in your face. It cost me something. Hoping costs something when you've been practicing not to. It's like a muscle you stopped using. Using it again is harder than it looks, and you feel it afterward." Cal kept his eyes on the fence line. "I'm glad you opened it." "I know you are," Ruth said. "So am I." From inside the house, Lily's voice drifted through the screen door. She'd evidently not been as thoroughly asleep as advertised, because she was conducting what appeared to be a conversation with no one, which was her method of processing important days. Cal could make out fragments, something about lavender, something about Professor Feathers, something about the relative merits of different types of soil. Ruth heard it too, and the corner of her mouth moved. "She does that," Cal said. "Narrates things when she's coming down from a big day. I used to worry about it. Now I think it's just how she files things." "Second-grade teachers see that all the time," Ruth said. children who need to say the day out loud to know it happened. She paused. Some adults do too. We just learn to do it in our heads and call it reflection. A car went past on the street in front of the house, its headlights briefly illuminating the front garden, the new plantings along the walk still establishing themselves in the evening soil. The neighborhood was doing its ordinary Saturday night thing, a dog somewhere, voices from a yard 2 doors down, the ambient sound of a street that was lived on by people who were living their lives in the unremarkable and sustaining way that most life was lived. Lily appeared in the screen door, hair slightly chaotic from her almost nap, holding the crayon drawing she'd made of Ruth weeks ago, the drawing that had been carried in her backpack shown to her teacher, presented to 2 kids at recess, and had traveled enough miles in a 5-year-old's possession to show it. She pushed the door open and crossed to Ruth without preamble, and held the drawing out with both hands. "Can I leave this here?" Her voice was matter-of-fact, the tone she used for things she'd thought through. "So your house has something from us even when we're not here." Ruth took the drawing with both hands, the careful receiving of something fragile. She looked at it, the purple and green crayon rendering of herself, the expression Lily had described as someone who used to smile more, the expression that was less accurate now than when Lily had drawn it. She looked at it for a long moment. "I'll put it right next to Gary," she said. Lily nodded, satisfied, and went back inside to finish her narration. Cal looked at his hands. Ruth looked at the drawing. The evening settled around them unhurried, the yard going slowly into blue with the departure of the light. 2 weeks later, a Saturday evening. Cal's car on Maple Drive, Lily in the passenger seat, the late May light coming through the windshield at the low angle that turned everything amber. The blue house had been repainted along the southern eaves. Not the whole house, just the faded section, Ruth having decided apparently that this was the right moment for the right repair. Not an overhaul, but a correction. The garden along the front walk was planted small and provisional, the particular optimism of things in their first weeks. Lily said, "She's cooking, I can tell." Cal turned off the engine. "You can't tell from a closed car." "I can tell," Lily said with the certainty of someone who had learned that being right repeatedly was its own form of evidence. He knocked. Ruth's voice, "It's open." The smell reached them in the front hall, something with lemon and herbs, warm and specific, the smell of a kitchen that was being used by someone who had remembered how to use it with intention. Marcus was in the living room on his Sunday call, which had become the reliable weekly architecture of his relationship with his mother, built not on grand gestures, but on the compound interest of small, consistent appearances. He raised a hand at Lily. She raised one back with the familiarity of someone greeting a regular. Eleanor was already at the kitchen table with a book comfortable as weather. She'd become that kind of presence in the house, not managed, not arranged, just there, the easy integration of someone who fit. Ruth was at the stove and she turned when she heard them come in, and her face when she saw them was simply and completely the face of someone glad to have people in her kitchen. Not performed gladness, not the careful managed brightness of a woman rationing her hope. Just the real thing, direct and unguarded, the face of a woman who had gotten used to having people in her house again, and had discovered in the getting used to it that this was what she'd been for all along. "Sit down," Ruth said. "It's almost ready." Lily climbed up next to Eleanor, who showed her the book, and Lily studied the illustrations with professional attention. In the living room, Marcus wrapped up his call. "Talk next Sunday. Wait, they're here, you want to say hi?" And suddenly Ruth was laughing in the kitchen, the real laugh. Taking the phone Marcus was holding out, saying, "Patrice, I'm right in the middle of," and still laughing the way you laughed when you were interrupted by something good. The house was loud. Not the performed loudness of people trying to fill a space, but the organic loudness of a house in use. Voices overlapping something on the stove, the scrape of a chair, Lily explaining to Eleanor with comprehensive authority why the Triceratops was systematically underestimated. It was the particular noise of a place where several people were present and were actually there, which was different from being physically located there in a way that mattered enormously and was impossible to manufacture. Cal sat at the kitchen table in the blue house on Maple Drive and thought about a 5-year-old at a school gate saying, "We have to go, not we should not, we could," because some things weren't optional, and she'd understood this without being taught it. He thought about a 4-second pause on a voicemail and what it had cost him to hear it clearly and what it would have cost him not to. He thought about a door opening on a Sunday afternoon and a woman's face doing two things at once, the brightening and the careful dimming of the brightening, the management of hope by someone who had learned to be afraid of it. He thought about what it meant that she'd opened the door anyway, what it cost to do that. What kind of thing you had to have decided about the world to keep opening the door after it had let in cold air enough times. His phone buzzed on the table. Bryan, Ohio Hospital signed. 3-year contract. Good referral work. Cal looked at the message. He turned the phone face down on the table. "It's ready," Ruth said. He stood up to help carry plates. Outside along the back fence the lavender was small and unhurried in the late May evening weeks from flowering months from being the thing it was going to be. It didn't know this. It was doing what it was doing, putting down roots in ground that had been prepared for it, growing in the direction of light, taking the time it took. Come spring it would smell like something good. Come spring a 5-year-old with a specific gift for accurate observation would lean toward it and confirm what she'd said the first time, like when something's going to be okay. It was already okay. It had been okay for a while now. They just needed enough time in the same place to notice.